Good evening. Welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I am Executive Director Alice Mong, and it is really a great a delight for me to be hosting this COVID-19 racism pandemic, a call to action for Asians. And this program is very close to my heart. It's something that we've been talking about since hearing of all sorts of anti-Asian discrimination, primarily in the beginning in the United States, but then now we have heard the pandemic, the racist, the virus, the pandemic anti-Asian virus going around in other parts of North America as well as Europe. So tonight we have some wonderful speakers, two joining us from New York and one from London. And we also want to take this discussion a bit further, rather than just talking about anti-Asian discrimination. We also want to take this opportunity to talk about what's happening in China. There has been also talks of anti-African discrimination. And in some ways, we want to talk about the anti-others. Tonight, it's a great opportunity to have a bigger discussion and how each of us can do something about it. I think there's so much hate around. In fact, there's too much hate around. As a Chinese American, when I used to run the Museum of Chinese in America, some of the issues are the yellow peril. Whenever there is a problem, you blame the others. And I think even 100 years ago, I think the anti-Asian or anti-Chinese that brought us the Exclusion Act. Is something that it's part of our Chinese American history and very much part of American history. And so right now, this is a wonderful time for us to have this discussion in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. So it's not a problem that's happening in the United States. It's not just a problem in each country, but it's a global problem as well, like the pandemic. So we're really delighted tonight that we have Hung Wei Lee, Advisor African Views Organization. Hung Wei is a journalist, and she will talk to us about Africa and China relations, something that she is an expert on. And Hung Wei is joining us from London. And the other two speakers, Ariel Estrada, co-founder, Racism is a Virus campaign, and founder and producing artist, director of Leviathan Lab, and he's joining us from New York. Telly Wong, creator and campaign director of Wash the Hate campaign, senior vice president and chief content officer, IW Group. And Telly is also joining us from New York. Before we bring on the speakers, we're going to show you a short video.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I also want to kind of remind the audience, we will start a Q&A at around 8:45, well, in about 45 minutes. And the question can be submitted to on www.slido.com, and the code is #7988. And please, we look forward to questions from the audience, online audience. So let me start off with Ariel about the campaign that you started, Racism is a Virus campaign. Tell us how it got started and what inspired you to do that.
Absolutely. Hey again, I'm Ariel Estrada, he, him, his, and I'm zooming in from the traditional land stolen from the Lenape people here in New York. And if anyone's visually impaired, I am a middle-aged Filipino-American man with a charcoal shirt on, and I'm calling in from my very small studio apartment here in Manhattan with my kitchen behind me. And you may or may not see two adorable kittens trying to play with me during this Zoom. So racism is a virus. This, of course, is in response to the rise of anti-Asian hate in the United States due to in the wake of the coronavirus. And currently, current reports and statistics are that there are 1,200 plus attacks that have occurred since the crisis began here in the States. It has been horrendous. One of the first weeks that we started, I think the second week we started, there was a terrible acid attack of a woman who was just taking out her garbage, and then someone came up behind her and threw acid in her face. And unfortunately, I haven't heard any updates on that. And of course, there's been any number of videos that have went viral of attacks that luckily people have been able to take. And this is not even some of the things that are reported because of attacks that have been happening to possibly to immigrant workers. So it's been terrible, and quite frankly, and we had to do a response. Racism as a virus for us has been a way to respond to this outward threat by awareness, by raising awareness around it, because in the rush of news here, and also with our current president here, 45, as I like to call him, 45, of course, was exacerbating this with his inflammatory rhetoric and encouraging people. His bully pulpit here is, the power of his pulpit is incredible, right? And it, of course, added to just added fuel to the fire here. This was we gathered with my wonderful dear colleague, Diane DeBoer-Phelan, and Jeremiah Abraham from Tremendous Communications. The three of us got together, and along with several other folks on the team, we brainstormed about some names for the campaign. And Diane originally had something that was less, wasn't quite as catchy, pardon the pun, and it just came to our heads: racism is a virus. I know that it's been used for another campaign at one point, but it was relatively small. So we were able to really sort of grow this campaign, and our sister campaign, Unapologetically Asian, along with it. We like to describe it as if racism is a virus is responding to an external threat, Unapologetically Asian is responding to our own internal growth and the things that we need to do as a group of people here, and granted, a very sort of pan-Asian group of people who each have unique enclaves, to look at our own hearts, look at our own center of what we can change about being Asian American here in the United States, and to ensure that we are seen as full Americans.
Great, thank you. And Telly, tell us about your campaign, hashtag Wash the Hate. When did you get started? Why? And I'm sure it's very similar in areas, but tell us what you hope to accomplish with this campaign.
Yeah, well, my colleagues and I, my day job is working at a marketing agency, and my colleagues and I just noticed the surge in the amounts of hate incidents that were occurring across the country, but especially in New York. And in some cases, there were more than one a day reported by the media. And we felt that we needed to do something, and we weren't sure what, but we felt we were in a unique position given our backgrounds and our experience and our relationships with certain types of people, that we could put something together fairly easily. So in the beginning of March, we just decided we need to do something. And the first thing we wanted to do, because we're an advertising agency, was perhaps do a PSA or a public service announcement or something like that. But then we realized that's gonna have to, we're gonna have to go approach a client with that, or approach someone with that, get some budget and then put something together, but that would take way too long, and things were moving so quickly. And things were changing every day. So we came up with an idea, which was not the idea that we landed on, but we came up with an idea on Friday. And by Monday, we realized that idea wasn't feasible anymore because of social distancing, the impending quarantine, and things like that. So we decided to do a completely digital campaign, which is how Wash the Hate happened. And what that campaign entails, we were asking people to wash their hands for at least 20 seconds in accordance with CDC regulations while they're sharing a personal story, how the pandemic has been affecting them. And we launched the day that Trump had that very infamous press conference where he was doubling down on his Chinese virus comments. And since then, we've just been getting a lot of great support from both the Asian American community and with our allies outside the community.
Great, thank you for that update. And now I want to turn it over to Hung Wei to talk about some of the racism, against, some of the issues that we heard about in Guangzhou against the Africans. This just happened also, very recently. So can you kind of give us an update on, you're covering this story and what's going on right now in Guangzhou or in China about racism?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for having me. I'm very delighted to join you here from London. So as many of you probably have seen from international media and social media platforms, many Africans in Guangzhou had pretty tough time last month. And before I answer your question, I'd like probably to provide some more background information of the incident. We know China has controlled the virus quite effectively, but all government officials are still very much afraid of a second wave and also imported cases from outside China. So in early March, when Europe was regarded as the epicenter of the pandemic, and all the passengers to Guangzhou from Europe had the coronavirus testing and also 14 days quarantine. While in March, the African continent was doing quite all right, and it wasn't regarded as epicenter, as there were not many cases in Africa at that time. So when passengers from Africa arrived in Guangzhou airport, only body temperatures were checked, and the quarantine wasn't also very strict. So and some even escaped from quarantine. And then by end of March and also early April, and there are some new coronavirus cases in Guangzhou, and the officials found out the new cases nearly all from Africa or had links with Africans. So basically the local government implemented mandatory testing and then additional 14-day quarantine for all African nationals in the city, regardless of whether they tested positive or not, regardless of whether they have left China or not. So I would say the discrimination was institutionalized and structuralized. And as I have spoken to some Africans in Guangzhou who haven't left China during the pandemic for the whole term, and they have been following all the instructions strictly by staying in their apartments, just like the other Chinese. But they were also asked to quarantine another 14 days. Some even got tested 3 or 4 times. And many Africans were also mistreated by landlords and hotel managers. And a lot of them got evicted from their apartments. And some of them couldn't even find places to live and end up sleeping on the street. And this you probably have already seen on the media. And also they were told that they are not welcome to restaurants, to shopping malls or parks. Although I think it's great to see that government officials and also community leaders in Guangzhou made some adjustments afterwards. And it's also great to see civil society groups in Guangzhou have been making efforts, working 24 hours, 7 days, with volunteers offering supplies and psychological support to people in need. But I think we really need more reflection on this, especially how can we avoid such things happen again.
It's very interesting hearing what Hung Wei is saying. I think you have 2 different approaches. Government, I think the problem in China, I think the government has taken the lead, and in some may say draconian with what's happened in Wuhan lockdown. But then my understanding with Guangzhou is the Beijing and local government and now are taking action. In the United States, again, there is also the tug of war between Washington and state, and some governors are a bit more progressive than others, and also the different message that we're hearing from Washington is definitely quite in some ways, calling the Chinese virus and all that, kind of exacerbating the problem. But again, I think what we're talking about, it's not uniquely United States or or China, what horrified me was watching the video of, remember the old man. At first I thought it was the United States, but it was an old man going into a store being dragged out because he had cough, and the video dragging the old man out, dumping him on the street. And that old man just reminded me of my father. So I was horrified, and only to find out this, I believe, happened in Canada. So it was not the United States. And now also hearing about here in Hong Kong, we've been keeping track of our own numbers, which is quite low. But about 2 months ago, when you guys started the campaign, the numbers between Hong Kong and Singapore were quite similar. But in Singapore's case, the migrant workers who are in the dormitories, their numbers really spiked up. So in some ways, COVID-19 tells me it knows it doesn't discriminate. And unfortunately, many of the African Americans or people who are not as well off are being hit quite hard. So it's really, really hard to see. So I think hearing these stories is one of the reasons we wanted to have this discussion. So with now turning back to New York and the US, for Ariel, I think the campaign has raised awareness. And one of the things that I'm curious in both, I guess for you and Telly, is sometimes with social media, I think we've had gained, right now the campaign successful, but how are you expanding it to the larger? Are you finding that with this social media campaign, not just speaking to the Asian or Asian Americans being discriminated, but how is the message being sent to a wider audience, the mainstream audience, so that we know we're being discriminated as an Asian or Asian Americans, but how is the mainstream audience taking both of your campaigns? How are you carrying that forward?
Sure, Telly, I'll go first. Hi, I'm Ariel Estrada again. I'm with Racism as a Virus and Unapologetically Asian. Thank you again to the Asia Society of Hong Kong for inviting us here. One of the wonderful things about the campaign is that, as you say, it's been focusing in mostly on Asian Americans here in the United States. And you know what, I don't find anything too terrible about that, because one of the things that certainly Asian Americans sometimes get accused of here in the United States, and they're not wrong, is that we aren't necessarily as involved politically. There's any number of reasons for that, or we're at least not perceived as being involved politically. And there's any number of reasons for that. Certainly part of it is cultural. I'm not to speak for the entire Pan-Asian diaspora, but generally culturally, there's a don't rock the boat mentality, and this is also factored into this also is the fact that that Asian Americans are the fastest growing poverty group in the United States, at 15% here in New York, actually, and it's just growing larger every day. So, these are not, we're not necessarily a model minority, as the stereotype goes of us, and that we're really encouraging people through this camp, particularly Asian American people, to fight. This is to fight and to actually use their voices in a very strong and almost, I would say, defiant way certainly against the rhetoric that 45 is encouraging, and that the only response that you can possibly have in this situation, particularly since 45 is so good at digital marketing, is to respond with a strong voice back, right? Again, which traditionally Asian Americans have not had. So it's been heartening, certainly, to see that. And this is not to say that that we haven't had allies in this from all racial groups here in the States, and also very heartening, right? But we're focusing in on this campaign certainly with the Asian American community first, just to encourage them to use their voices.
Great. And Telly, can you tell us kind of in terms of the broader audience, the mainstream audience, how have your campaign?
That's really been one of our key missions. When we started the campaign, there was really two primary objectives. One was to give voice to the community, not just have a couple of spokespeople represent everybody, but create a platform that allows everyone to share their experience. And then beyond that, we were really trying to spark and inspire conversation that's happening between different communities and going beyond our community. Oftentimes, I think I've been involved with the Asian American community for many, many years. And I think a lot of times we just end up talking amongst each other. And we really don't get to share and educate others about our experience. As our campaign was happening, I would meet different kinds of people, very well-educated people. And I would share with them our campaign, and they would tell us, oh yes, this is great, you're doing this because this is the first time the Asian American or the Chinese American community is facing this level of racism. And I said, well, yeah, I don't know if you've really looked into the history of this is not the first time this has ever happened. This is not the second time it's ever happened. This is something that seems to happen once every generation. So now this month, it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in the States. So we've been using this opportunity to participate in panels like this and have conversations with other communities about this issue and others. And then we also recently produced a public service announcement featuring some of our higher profile campaign supporters. And the purpose of that PSA is aimed at an audience beyond the Asian American community. And what that PSA is trying to do is get people that are not Asian American or not Asian to really understand what it's like now in the midst of this pandemic, to walk around and feel vulnerable and be the object of hate and aggression. Really, that's how we're pivoting right now, is we're really trying to get other communities to understand our situation, provide a little bit of context, and then also open up more dialogue.
Last week I just saw the Asian American documentary made by PBS, and it was the history of anti-Asian discrimination. And again, when it comes to something like this, we all Asians, we all look alike, whether you're Japanese, Filipino. In fact, recently there was a case of a Native American who also was discriminated because they thought she was Asian. So I think, and it's wonderful to take this month, APA Heritage Month in the US, to really talk about this and because also I think Ariel also kind of alluded it. I mean, this is also an election year. I think it is really important for Asians to speak up, and I applaud the use of social media. And I think because Asians are quite young, it was Asian Americans in terms of the demographics. So the use of social media and PSA. And I think on that note, I also want to ask Hung Wei about the, social media is so big in China. They have their own through WeChat and Weibo and all of the other stuff. How do you think that is helping also build awareness about discrimination with the Africans or just minority community in China in the fight of COVID in China?
Thank you very much for the question. I think in terms of social media, I always see polarization in the media. As you said, there are more and more extreme and also racist expression in social media. And it's quite worrying, I think. And we also know that the public sensitivity in China to racism, particularly to Africans, has been very low, and little efforts has been made to educate Chinese public against racism or to emphasize the importance of political correctness. So it's actually not surprising that we can even see racist advertisement on TV. And in terms of media, I really think Chinese media, no matter state-owned media or social media, should be more diversified when it comes to covering Africa-related story. We see that most of the Chinese media also refuse to acknowledge any discrimination underlying the crisis, and let alone any collective reflection. For example, the Global Times newspaper, it dismissed what happened in Guangzhou as a Western trap. yeah, which actually reminds me of what Shasta Irakumla, and the Pakistani writer, her writer's words, because in 1948, when she was her country's delegate to UN General Assembly, she said, in matters of discrimination on racial and national grounds, American England and also many other European countries, to my great surprise, took up an extraordinarily reactionary attitude. They continuously opposed article by article or specific mention of non-discrimination. So as I said, I think this is many years after that, and I think we don't need to repeat Western countries' mistakes. And I think Chinese media oftentimes presented the story of Africa through an official and mainstream perspective, while self-media or social media have been continuously strengthening public stereotypes on African people. And just as the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie pointed out, the dangers of a single story, which creates stereotypes and also problems, I think this is quite serious issue in China, and especially in the social media. I think that's really very worrying, and that's no good to the relationship between China and Africa.
I think a really good point there. Today, before this program, I saw, I did my homework, and Asia Society LA earlier in the month hosted several of these town halls. And one of the, Van Jones, CNN political commentator, African-American, and he had a very interesting point about a breakdown can be a breakthrough. And it's times like this, we should have some sort of dialogue, because my understanding with some of the discrimination, there has also been among, in the US, some of the incidents I've seen has been also African Americans against Asians, and also right now, knowing the COVID statistics, how much is affecting the African American community. So the point he makes is focus on wellness and oneness. So one of the reason we want to have this discussion is really talking about the unity. It's the discrimination is, again, it's not just against Chinese, but against Asians, but also we're also hearing discrimination against Africans. And what are some of the things that we can talk about in terms of unity and the oneness and the wellness. So I'm really delighted that we, Asia Society Hong Kong, are also working on a campaign to teach people, to try to teach about, we can teach hate, but we can also teach caring and love and connection. So that's one of the things we hope to do. This is going to be first of many programs that we were going to focus on. But right now, I think one of the questions, I want to also turn back to Ariel and Telly. In terms of this year's, we were talking about the anti-Asian. How do you think candidates like Andrew Yang, I know I was just reading the op-ed he wrote about that caused also quite a bit of controversy. His point was about we need to be more American and help fight this virus. But I think there's been also a controversy about his interpretation of people almost accuse him of being maybe too much of a model minority and trying to be American to deal with this issue. I'm curious to hear your points about the Andrew Yang issue. On the one hand, I'm very proud. He spoke here at Asia Society Hong Kong in October in 2018 about his book, and now he ran almost quite successfully until he dropped out of the campaign. But this model minority myth, and how are we, with this campaign dealing with this COVID-19? Your take on his point. If Telly, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Wow, I think it's great that we're discussing some nuances, because I think that's something that's been lost in some of these early conversations. Because as you pointed out, this is not just a Republican and Democrat issue. This is not, and as you mentioned, there's been a diversity in the perpetrators of some of these hate incidents, especially in the US. This is not just purely something that MAGA cap wearing racists are going around to attacking Asians. And in regards to the Andrew Yang point, that's actually, it was funny, when we launched our campaign, we got some blowback from certain people in the community saying that this should not be your message. It's so negative. You should be focusing on how Asian Americans are patriotic and supporting our country and contributing to the issue, contributing and to the solution. And I just felt personally that that was sort of a non sequitur. I don't see how one has to do with the other. And it's sort of, and that speaks to some of the geopolitical politics that we're dealing with now, because we, as a campaign in the US addressing Asian American violence against Asian Americans, seem to have to answer for things that are happening in Guangzhou at a McDonald's. And I think there's this conflation of different issues. But with the Andrew Yang piece, what was fascinating, just to go back to that, was that that was sort of the tact after 9/11, after September 11th, with the Muslim community and the South Asian community. People were saying that that's sort of how we want to demonstrate our Americanness, to deflect these people questioning our patriotism. And I think 20 years later, it's fascinating to see that mindsets have changed and approaches have changed, and there's more debate happening within the Asian American community. And that's a healthy thing. It's great that people can disagree, and people can disagree with Andrew Yang, and he has his points. And but I think it's wonderful that we're able to have this debate, because we're in the process right now, 20 years removed from September 11th, where America is going through this painful process right now. We're redefining what an American is. And I think a lot of people are having difficulty with that. And I think that's what something that all Ariel, myself, and everyone else's campaigns are that's sort of an underlying issue, is what does it mean to be American? Who gets to say they're American, and who gets to define that?
Ariel?
Yes, it's really interesting actually that you had actually started that out with some of the racial disparities that have been really laid bare by COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic. Just to go through some of those terrible statistics, Blacks and African Americans, for example, here in the United States, they represent less than 15% of the American population, yet they represent 50% of the deaths from the virus. Our Latino workers here in the United States are experiencing a much higher rate of unemployment. And that's partly due to some of them being undocumented and some of them working under the books. The Navajo Nation here, with our indigenous peoples, if it were a state, they would be the worst affected state in the union. And I could go on and on. Of course, there's also what's happening here with discrimination against the LGBTQ community, with not being able to donate blood here in the United States. It's laying bare all these terrible inequities. And this is, as to Telly's point, this does happen every generation or so, where all of a sudden there's a massive xenophobic rise, right? The last time we saw this, of course, again, was 9/11 against the Muslim community and the Sikh community, right? And now we're seeing it against Asians, not just Asians, we're seeing it against pretty much all people of color. The takeaway from that, of course, is that this is an effect of basically white supremacy and late stage capitalism here in the United States, right? And the effects of how much inequity this causes. Now, to lead back to what you said about Andrew Yang, in light of all that racial disparity that's happening here, that's being exposed because of COVID, and the anemic response of 45's government to COVID here, and resulting in now almost 100,000 deaths, an unthinkable, horrible number. You can't see Yang's response as anything but tone deaf, absolutely tone deaf. One thing it did do was certainly mobilize the Asian American community here to roundly thrub him for his response. Of course, this is all in the context of the fact that many people may not know that he's also possibly vying for a mayoral run here in the States, right, in New York, right? This, of course, adds to the fact that he is trying to be as relevant as possible in light of Americans' very short attention spans. This is, not to be too conspiracy theorist about it, but there is certainly an aspect of this where he's trying to stay in the public eye. And it certainly worked with that, and it got a lot of attention. Is All Americans, his current campaign, effective? Particularly in light of that he's gotten like many people of color, not just Asian Americans, to be part of that. I would argue that this is probably the way to not engage other Asian or other people of color, mostly because it's more of the same. He's sort of saying through both, his op-ed, his, rather repulsive op-ed in the, and I'm so sorry, and I know he was a guest at Asia Society Hong Kong, but I got to call a spade a spade.
Right.
It was not great at messaging, and again, incredibly tone deaf. He's trying to engage people in a way that's saying, and Asian Americans in particular, by saying like, we need to apologize for who we are. We do not need to apologize for who we are. We do not need to hide our culture, right? Again, both with racism as a virus and our unapologetically Asian campaign, this is almost in direct response to that. We can be exactly who we are. Muslims can walk down the street. Sikhs can walk down the street with their turban, and they, Native American or indigenous peoples deserve to have health care for the crisis. Black Americans shouldn't be dying at disproportionate rates. All these things are wrong, and we shouldn't be, trying to sugarcoat it by trying to apologize for who we are.
I think very well said. In fact, I'm going to quote Lisa Ling here, who also was very eloquent on the program with our LA Center. She says, strong people stand up for themselves. Stronger people stand up for others. And so I think in times like this, I think it's not just, and again, the pandemic was not discriminating whether you're Asian or Africans or any race. I mean, it's hitting right now over 5 million people worldwide, and we've never seen anything like this. I guess last time was the Spanish flu 100 years ago to the scale. So right now, what I'm sitting here in Hong Kong, I think a lot of what you, Telly and Ariel talked about is the identity. We're Chinese American. I'm a Chinese American, very proud of it. But here in Hong Kong, we are also seeing discrimination. Unfortunately, because of, in fact, we are. This is a really interesting time here in Hong Kong, and I think discrimination. There is also an issue of what is Chinese or what is Hong Kong these days. So it's a very interesting discussion all worldwide, but also in Europe too. I think the anti-immigration and all that. So I guess with Hong Wei, I wanted to ask you about China in terms of its the way it sees itself right now. There has been talk about these the wolf mentality in terms of speaking up. I mean, I think China, because of the history of the Opium War, and remember Wall Street Journal quoting the headline "Sick Man of Asia" and "Sick Man of Asia," which was very much not taken very favorably by the Chinese government. So this idea of, right now with China's rise, there's obviously a lot of fear. So I think from your point of view, how do you see China dealing with kind of this lack of, I guess, this lack of diversity-ness? I think a couple of years ago, watching the one of the Chinese New Year shows, the way the political incorrectness of, I think it was blackface in yellow face is something, unfortunately, in the United States we've seen quite a few decades ago, but in China you're seeing that. So how do you think younger generation? How do you think, because you guys are all growing up, traveling quite a bit and all of that, but how do you think China is seeing itself in the rise of, I guess I'm not asking you to talk about the government, but more about the people. Chinese people are traveling more. In fact, some would argue because of a globalization that we're seeing, the global pandemic. But average Chinese people, how do you see their role in the world?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And there are more and more Chinese going abroad, especially the younger generation. And I definitely believe that they can do much better and they can do more. And so maybe I'll share some positive stories. For instance, there is a WeChat group called Sanyuanli Solidarity, which is a group of volunteers. Most of them are university students. They have been working very hard to support Africans in Guangzhou by helping them order food, registering and the health code, and also give them psychological support. And I recently also noticed another online campaign called I'm a Panda, organized by a Chinese arts group in Guangzhou. And I think the campaign is very creative as it uses panda to stand against racial discrimination by calling for panda-style love and peace, because we know that panda is black, it's white, and also Asian. So I think this is very creative, and there are actually also a lot of things have been done by the younger Chinese generation. And I think this is definitely a positive side of the story. But I think as China goes global, the story it's also very, very complicated and nuanced. Another thing I think makes me quite worried, and we haven't really talked about today, is that there have also been growing anti-Chinese sentiment in Africa too, and Zambia, for example, and this is always also linked with local politics and also populist politicians. For example, we saw there are more and more Chinese going abroad, going to Africa for business. But we recently saw the Lusaka mayor recently calling Chinese Chinamen, which is a really racist and sensitive word. And yeah, and on internet, you would also see some Africans calling Chinese pig or use some violent and horrified words, sometimes even in my Twitter comments. So I think for ordinary young men and women, no matter where you are from and which race you belong to, when your friends say something racist, you probably could have a gentle conversation with him or her and tell him this is wrong and why it is wrong. And I think I'd like to re-emphasize the importance of education, as Alice you just mentioned, as no one was born as a racist. Just like Nelson Mandela once said, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can also be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. I think we really need to have more serious public discussion and education on the topic of race. And the public needs to know the dangers of racism. I think what Aria and also Charlie has done is just amazing. And it's really important to have more collective reflection, awareness, interaction, and also serious public discussion and debates such like this.
I think that's a great point. In fact, part of our campaign is we are going to be talking about teaching. You got to be carefully taught was one of my favorite songs from one of my favorite musicals, South Pacific. And I just remember Lieutenant Cable singing that song, You Got to Be Carefully Taught by his family, in his case, from Philadelphia, to hate with people eyes of an oddly shaped. And that song and that play was from the 50s. And we're hoping that we can build on that. You can also be taught to care and to do something about it. And right now, I think with the power of youth, social media, but also just speaking up. And I'm so proud of all of you, because I think in that, and growing up as a Chinese American, and we arrived in the States in the 70s, there weren't that many of us. Speaking up was not something that we were taught to do. In fact, we were taught to stay quiet and make sure that we don't rock the boat. And I think this is a very different time. And I think COVID-19, again, proved to us that, and even before COVID-19, I think racism in all over and anti-immigration. So I think it just reminds us the importance of speaking up and really rational rather than letting the emotion and the violence get in the way. So one of the questions that I think we're seeing from the audience is that this particular one, I think, asks, is your racism is a virus and Wash the Hate campaign? You have heard about countless stories. Is there a particular story that stood out to you? So I can ask Tally to start, any particular case that really stood out to you in your particular campaign about racism?
In our particular campaign, well, one thing that really hit home for me was the day we launched the campaign, Wash the Hate. I sent an email out to some friends and let them know this is, my team has launched this campaign. Please check it out, support it. Just as, FYI. And then later that afternoon, I got an email back from a friend of mine who I've known for 20 years. She's this Asian woman in her 60s, living in New York for 20 years. And she told me she's so happy that we did this campaign because she experienced an incident a day ago where she was walking along the street. She was wearing a face mask. It was in the East Village in New York, so a fairly safe neighborhood in the afternoon. And she was walking out of a supermarket and someone went up to her, didn't say a word. And this was at a time when it wasn't very common to be wearing a face mask in New York, and just grabbed her and just shoved her to the ground. And she broke her hand. And then she wrote me back and she just said, in my 20 some odd years living in New York, I've never felt, this has never happened to me before. And I've never felt unsafe to the degree that I have now. And that just sort of really reminded me why we were doing the campaign, because we want to build some solidarity within our community and also hopefully build roads outside of it. And just a quick story. I grew up in New York in the 80s and 90s, and that's when there were a lot of attacks and robberies and assaults happening against Chinese food delivery men. And as a child growing up with a father that owned a grocery store and our neighbors was a Chinese takeout restaurant, I used to just be so afraid that I'd come home one day, my dad wouldn't be there, or my neighbor would get killed or something like that. And I remember seeing those stories in the news, and there was never sort of anyone speaking up on behalf of the victims. And we didn't have leaders back then, like very high-profile Asian American leaders, taking a stand and sort of giving the community a voice. And I think that's one of my personal reasons for getting involved with this campaign. And hopefully we can learn from history and really provide some of that comfort and demonstrate to the community that someone is looking out for them, especially in these times.
Well said. Ariel? Well,
there are any number of stories that have been in the news, and including the one that I spoke of earlier with the horrible acid attack against that poor woman. But that I'll have to tell you that the story that's sticking most out in my mind is the one that happened to me personally. I was walking down the street, and then another man of color, much bigger than I am, because I'm a fairly small statured man, I'm 5'6", just basically saying that the virus was my fault, and that this was that I shouldn't be here, that I should go home, and basically saying all the things that you would expect someone to say. And that it really was, I have had a lot of de-escalation trainings and self-defense training, so I knew just to get out of there, and I ducked into a store. At that point, stores were still open. I ducked into a store immediately just to sort of de-escalate it. Knowing that this was, then trying to acknowledge that this was happening to me, knowing that it was another man of color that this was happening to me, and having to remind myself that this was this was not a Black issue or an Asian issue, that this was another reflection of the fact that white supremacy in the United States, one of the functions of it is to pit other people of color against each other. And it was a wonderful reminder of me to again, think compassionately, think with care, think that this is, he was from the Black community. Who knows how badly his life has been personally affected by this, right? And it was a real reminder for me even though I felt unsafe, and that yes, I had to be able to go and take care of myself and remind myself that isn't my fault. But also to remind myself that there's a much bigger picture involved here of how racism works. And, of course, especially hearing from Hong Wei about some of the stories that are happening and the worldwide perspective of what's happening. the virus is really showing us, and again, to Telly's point from earlier, that this happens every generation, and that the virus, the pandemics have a tendency, or crises have a tendency to bring out xenophobia, in this case, pretty extreme xenophobia as well, and that we have the lessons of history behind us to tell us that, hey, this is going to be politicized against people of color, against oppressed people, and that we can use these campaigns with Wash the Hate, Racism is a Virus, Unapologetically Asian, the wonderful campaigns that you're coming up with as well, to really draw out the fact that this is not our fault and there's a bigger picture involved here.
I want to turn to Hong Wei now. You're in London. Are you also seeing similar anti-Asian discriminations against the Asian community in UK? Are you seeing that?
Definitely. Personally speaking, I haven't been attacked, but many of my friends, some of them are South Korean, or some of them are from Singapore or from Indian, and because they look like Chinese or they look Asian, they got attacked or got assaulted, from people, and they were called Chinese virus. And for myself, every time I went out, if I wear a mask, I would be like scared sometimes, because I saw a lot of stories from the news. I also heard so many horrified stories from my Asian friends. I think it's really worries. It's really worrying, and I hope it's going to change. And I think since the pandemic began, we have really witnessing scapegoating and hostility towards different race, which is an imagined other. And there are so many racist expressions and behaviors online and offline. And I really believe it wasn't meant to be like this, and it doesn't need to be.
But I find it interesting that this virus is hitting, shortly after Brexit, and in the United States after the election of President Trump, and it's like it's almost this perfect storm it's pre-COVID. There were already racists. In fact, they feel like the rise of racism, and now with COVID, there seems to be a justification of that. And I think it's times like this that we really need to speak up, and we also need to speak up collectively. Hate is wrong, regardless of what political people's political belief. Hate is wrong, and I think this is one of the reasons we wanted to have this discussion and begin it, and then also carry on forward. Some of the other question here is that I think you guys already touched upon is really how can Asian communities really gather together and really defend each other against racism? I know the campaigns that you two, Ariel and Telly, has talked about, and what are some of the efforts that we can also work on together in this election year? And Hong Wei, I also want you to address that in terms of the role of China. I think, do they realize importance of soft power? I just feel like rise of China is creating a lot of fear. So I think that question I was going to ask Hong Wei, but in terms of the two of you, Tali and Ariel, the unity of the Asian community, how do you think we can work on more? Ariel?
Sure. First off, I want to highlight the work of two groups or three groups actually, that I think are wonderful. One is, and this is a wonderful response, of course, to the rise of anti-Asian hate and hate crimes, is to report. Right? There's an old. I used to train a lot of both physical self-defense and de-escalation training and anti-violence training. And still do, but one of the adages of main adages of self-defense is to let people know, right, that this is happening. And two groups that are doing that are A3PCon, the Asian American Pacific Planning Council. They started a fantastic online reporting tool, as well as the work of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which we donate part of our t-shirt proceeds to. That both groups are doing some wonderful reporting tools, as well as their on-the-ground work to help Asian Americans who have been affected by this violence. Locally in New York City, there's a group that that Unapologetically Asian, our sister campaign, is working with, the Coalition for Asian Children and Families here in New York. I mentioned earlier that poverty levels among Asian Americans are the fastest growing group in New York, and they work actively with a broad coalition of Asian American groups. And this is sometimes odd for people from Hong Kong to hear, or for people who are in Asia to hear. But of course, the communities here in New York, in the United States are extremely diasporic, right? It's from everywhere. And we have basically the only thing connecting us is that we are all from the Asian continent. So trying to gather those people together, of course, is very tough. There are, of course, cultural similarities because we're all from similar parts of the world, right? And I think that gathering these folks, Asian Americans generally vote in a particular way. They vote Democratic, right? But I think, of course, appealing to what is going to affect their communities most, right? As we can see, 45's policies have a tendency to be or are extremely divisive, and they're extremely harmful to the Asian community. And of course, his tactic of his campaign is to double down on trying to be divisive and splitting us apart, and see us as us against them, right? The more that we can come up with campaigns to be unifying, to gather ourselves, to gather our voices together, and to realize that we are in solidarity, not only with other Asian communities, but with our other communities of color, other oppressed communities, with the LGBTQ community, neurodiverse, the on and on of how many people 45 has basically intentionally offended in the hopes to galvanize his base. Whatever we can do to galvanize us is going to combat that very effectively.
Telly?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is get people to speak up. We want to break the silence, because silence fosters indifference, indifference fosters inaction. And right now we can't afford to just stand around and wait for something, wait for our problems to be solved. We have to be proactive. So one thing we're doing with our campaign is just, again, we're encouraging more people to share their personal stories, so we could really put a nuanced narrative out there, and it's not just a handful of people's experiences. And something else we've been doing, and I alluded to this earlier in the conversation, we're trying to just create platforms for discussions where we could really discuss politics, discuss the larger issues in much more nuance, because I think it's very difficult to just capture everything that we've been speaking about for the past hour in a soundbite or a couple of sentences. We really need to do a deeper dive for not only the Asian American community to understand, especially the younger generation, but also others that might not know about Asian American history and might not know about some of the precedents of situations like this. So more conversation, more dialogue, and just find a way to leverage your platform. So one thing that we've been doing this month is some of our supporters in the Asian community, they work at corporations and different companies. They have ERG groups, which are employee resource groups, which are Asian American employee groups, and they've been using the connection to set up panels and talks at their companies, talking to everybody at their company about this issue.
That's great. That's wonderful to hear. So I'm going to have the last word to Heng Wei about China, because this year is election year, and I know in the U.S. seems to be the last couple of election cycle China bashing, and it seems like president is also kind of using this. But what is China doing about it in terms of like the soft power, its rise? What do you think?
Thank you very much for the question, which I think is really interesting and important. Indeed, I think China has been trying really hard to promote soft power globally. And you know that senior political leader, Wang Huning, he was actually the one who introduced the idea of soft power to China as one of the earliest scholars in 1990s. And China has definitely spent a lot of money and efforts in terms of promoting soft power globally and also in Africa. For example, through media investment, which, as we know, that Chinese media investment in Africa extends across almost all platforms, including newspapers, magazines, radio, online media, and also TV cable, and in many, many African countries. But unfortunately, I think most scholars, at least, as far as I know, they tend to view China, the power Chinese, the Chinese government tend to create it as sharp power instead of soft power. And for example, like what China is doing this time during the pandemic, is that Chinese government, also Chinese companies such as Alibaba and Chinese associations in Africa, they have actually done quite an impressive work to support African countries in this very unsettling time, including sending medical doctors to Africa and also sending tons of medical equipments, including PPEs and also masks. But it seems many international media are still quite critical about this and calling this is coronavirus propaganda or diplomacy. And of course, this is also certainly due with related with Western media's very Orientalist approach. But what I want to highlight today is that I think from a long-term perspective, China should really strengthen its public education on the topic of anti-racism and probably focus more on the people-to-people relationship, because economic and political relationships between governments alone will not help China address such crises and also other potential issues. And if China wants to present its image as a major and responsible player in the world, it must not only confront racist tendencies at home, but also shows that their promises to Africa or weaker countries or smaller countries also can be extended to their citizens. And in addition, I think it's also very important to note that the need for minority input in the creation and implementation of any strategies and also policies. Only by doing that, the Chinese soft power promotion could possibly be successful. Instead of always be looking at it as a threat of the world.
Thank you, Hongwei, for that really thoughtful comment. And I think sitting here in Hong Kong, I'm really delighted that tonight have this discussion. And this is the first of many. And I want to thank Ariel, Kelly, and Hongwei for your thoughtful and very nuanced comments. And I think, this reminds me in that our president, Josette Chernin, always has a quote. Here at Asia Society, we shed light, not heat. And in this current climate of too much heat, not enough light, and that's what we're here to do. And another term that we've been using quite a bit, and I think because of COVID, we truly are in this together. It doesn't just impact one group or one race, and it impacts all of us. And so it's by working together and collaboratively, China and US, China and the world, US and the world, that we can find hopefully a solution to this global pandemic in the near future, whether it's drugs or a vaccine. Because on our own, it's going to take a lot of effort. But if we work together, hopefully it'll make this global pandemic end a lot sooner. And that's what I'm hoping for sitting here. But it really, I want to thank all three of you for this wonderful discussion and look forward to welcome you back because I think we need to continue to focus on this issue. Discrimination, hate is not what we need. I think we need collaboration and partnership moving forward. So thank you and good night. And everybody stay safe and healthy. And we look forward to future Asia Society.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Good afternoon. Good morning.